All right, how far into Hammurabi's Code did we get? Okay, all right, excellent. And just as a recap, just make sure I don't leave things out from that, because the law was written down such that people could read it, it was also publicly available. It was displayed on this stone pillar. Okay, and because it was actually carved in stone, it was relatively permanent, so people could expect consistency in the law. Those are all things that are necessary if rule of law is going to work. And that's why Hammurabi's Code is just a darling of testers in government classes around the country. Now, we started again with some of the more ancient origins of democracy. I mean, obviously, Hammurabi's Code goes back a very long time, even close to 4,000 years on that one. The sovereign state, as I said yesterday, is a recent invention. Now, we do have some things that you could look to and say, well, wasn't that like a state? Kind of. The Greek city-states, in a lot of ways, were kind of like the world today in miniature. And they did often function a lot like what we would think of as states. But they're not quite. Remember, you have 4 theories for the origin of states. You have the force theory. Somebody comes in, a group comes in, they take over a territory, they impose a state. Okay. Divine right, philosophy that there is a ruler of the state chosen by God to do that job. There's evolutionary theories that states slowly develop over time within a society. And then, of course, the one we've spent the most time with, social contract. The idea that people exchange some of their rights in order to empower a government to protect other rights. The reason I'm not spending too much time on that here is, in a lot of ways, I don't see the different theories as all that useful. You're not going to find very many states where one of those theories explains it all by itself. And often you're going to see all 4 of them in a single state. France would be a good example of that. Now, this little animated map is just showing really territorial change, but it captures some of what's going on. France gets its name from the Franks, a Germanic group that moved into the Roman Empire and took that territory. They developed something like a state. They did it by force. Later, of course, we have French kings who claimed divine right. They weren't the only ones doing this, but they were some of them. We have an evolutionary process where there are revolutions. There's Napoleon, and now France is on its 5th Republic, 4th Republic. Sometimes I lose count. I think it's the 5th Republic. And of course, involved in that is also social contract. But it kind of developed as a result of that process. It is appropriate to talk about France because what we think of as the modern state is something that develops in Europe. And this is a very quick and minimal explanation for the state. So we get powerful absolute monarchs arriving in early modern Europe. After the Renaissance period, we have these powerful monarchs. People like Louis XIV, for example. I mean, although he's later, but he's kind of a classic example of the absolute monarch, the Sun King. And these absolute monarchs took advantage of the fact that feudalism is already weakening because of stuff you learned about in world history. The commercial revolution, the development of towns, the Black Death that kills off a lot of peasants and all of a sudden makes peasants more valuable. There's also growing nationalism. And a lot of this, especially if we are talking about France, a lot of this is a result of the 100 Years' War. between England and France, where the English and the French increasingly see themselves as English and French. They also built more effective governments. And they did this not because they were nice and wanted good governance, but they wanted to be able to control their population, in large part so that they could better tax it. Okay? You can't tax people if you don't know who they are, and you don't know where they are, and you don't know what they have. Which leads to the next point. This explanation has been challenged by some, but it's really pretty solid. And it's summed up by Charles Tilly in his 1992 book, in which he is famous for writing War Made the State and the State Made War. Europe was known as the cockpit of the world. Now, don't think about that as cockpit in terms of like an airplane. We're talking about like a place where roosters, right, are fighting, like that kind of cockpit. And in this story, the roosters would be some of those powerful monarchs. In order to be constantly fighting with each other, they needed to have effective militaries. And in this time period, those militaries are starting to look more modern. They have gunpowder weapons. We have new fortresses that are meant to counter those gunpowder weapons. This is a star fortress. So, castles don't work anymore. You've got to build new forts. It's expensive. A lot of it was kind of really seen as scientific work. For those gunpowder weapons, you need to start training what we call regular soldiers. And they're kind of regular in the sense that they are regulated and their actions are regularized. Or standardized would be another way to say it. We start treating soldiers as interchangeable parts in a military machine. They all learn very specific drills. There are drill manuals. Right? We now have drill sergeants that teach soldiers how to fight, kind of like you've seen them fight if you've watched movies about the Napoleonic Wars or the American Revolution. Form up in ranks. Everybody loads and fires at the same time. The next group of soldiers behind them fires, everybody reloads. You've got to time this stuff out right. You're not relying on knights and horsebacks and archers anymore. All of this is expensive. And so this reinforces the need to build more effective, centralized governments. And then, right, we have all of the bits of government, effective governments that are essential to a state. That's the third characteristic of a state that we saw. In 1648, we get the introduction of the notion of sovereignty. Now, it's pretty limited at this point. It's limited really to rulers of states being able to decide what will be essentially the official religion in their territory. Because 1648 Treaty of Westphalia ends the 30 Years' War, which is largely still seen as a war between Protestants and Catholics. All right, from that point, the idea of sovereignty becomes a little more refined. European states get stronger and stronger. And then they kind of go on the road, so to speak, and build empires that cover most of the globe. I mean, in this period, a lot of it we're going to be talking about in Africa and Asia, more so than in the Americas. But of course, the colonial legacy also spreads the state, albeit in kind of a different way, to the New World. Now, it's not just European imperialism. I mean, that takes European concepts around the world, but it's also reinforced by the settlements of World War I and World War II. Yeah, in World War I, in your U.S. history class, you learned about Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points, self-determination. Nations should be able to have their own states. That certainly reinforces the state system. World War II, at the end of that, we have the formation of the United Nations, which obviously not altogether effectively outlaws aggressive war, which means states aren't supposed to be using war to change their boundaries. Okay, that kind of helps create a harder shell of inviolable borders around states. And then, of course, also one of the things that's coming out of here, after World War II, shortly thereafter, we start to see increasingly decolonization. And what happens when the former colonies become independent? They form states. So that is the quick and dirty version of how we got to the modern state. Now we have to add the democratic part of it. Remember, as I said yesterday, by necessity, our focus is going to be Euro, and here, very much Anglo-American centric. And even then, we still have to focus on just some key moments on the timeline. And some of them actually go quite far back. King Henry II introduces the idea of jury trials for people accused of crimes, and also habeas corpus, which is show me the body. You can't just arrest someone without charging them with a crime and just detain them indefinitely or imprison them indefinitely without charging them and having a trial. He also improved the English court system, and that begins to build up the common law tradition. The common law tradition is what kind of the Anglo-influenced world, including the United States, relies on for its system of law. All 49 states, I said all 49 states, because there is one exception. Louisiana is the one exception. Their state law system is based on the Napoleonic Code because of their history as French territory. Common law relies on precedent. It's the idea that court rulings in time period A should be relied on by courts making decisions in time period B. Okay, so courts rely on past decisions to rule in future cases. And that builds up the body of common law. And this itself is important for establishing rule of law, to make sure that courts are looking to each other's decisions to ensure that the law is being applied fairly and consistently. And some of these we'll look in more detail. Magna Carta will be one of them. It put in writing notions of limited government, provided some due process protections. The government can't take your life or liberty or property without some kind of due process of law. It creates, the British always say this creates the parliament. It's really an embryonic parliament. It's very small, only barons get to be a part of it. But it is kind of an early forerunner of a legislature in the English-speaking world. In your reading assignment for homework, you'll learn more about the English Bill of Rights, so I'm just kind of going to introduce it as something to bring it to your attention for your focus in your reading notes. We will later compare it to the U.S. Bill of Rights, and that will kind of help us see that historical legacy in our own constitutional system. Oops. Sorry, I told you guys would have to keep up, but I did not mean to take that away from you so soon. And some of these things you're going to see are going to question, or might lead you to question, just how original the thinking of our founding fathers truly was. Okay. Oops. Why is that on there twice? device. Oh, wow. All right. I meant to take some of that other stuff away. So, all right. Well, sorry, this will be out of order. I don't know why that even happened. Okay, I guess that's what I get when I work on two computers that aren't necessarily connected to the internet at the same time. All right. The order, I mean, as long as you keep it at 1628, you'll be all right. Okay. There is the Petition of Right in 1628. All right. In a lot of ways, it just kind of reiterates some of the stuff that Magna Carta was supposed to do but hadn't worked out perfectly. So it reinforces the principles of limited government and also the principles of due process. And I'm sorry about doing that to your notes, especially for those of you taking it on pen and paper. All right, and then, of course, we do get back to the English Bill of Rights, which was already mentioned, of course, out of order. And then Cato's letters. And now, Cato, this is a reference to ancient thinkers, but the ideas were resurrected, and the name was resurrected. This was in Britain. It was influential in the colonies, but one of the things it argued against was essentially unfair elitist government. The idea that the government should not be unduly controlled only by the rich part of the population and serving the rich part of the population. That the government should be influenced by and working for everybody. All right. And then this, I mean, again, a lot of this is going to be to highlight things that you need to pick up on in the reading. The Virginia Assembly, 1619, introduces the idea of representative government. In the colonies, the Mayflower Compact, as you will see, introduces the idea that people, I mean, this is very much a social contract. The people agree to govern themselves, which of course also introduces the idea that the colonies can govern themselves without input from the British government. You will read about the Massachusetts Body of Liberties, which I'm going to guess that you guys can look at the name and assume that that's going to be something like a Bill of Rights. And this is not the end of development of the democratic state. But for where we're going to be picking up with history, it's the perfect stopping point for us. All right. That's in terms of the history there. When I say stopping point for us, I probably misled you guys. I meant stopping point for that Anglo-American, specifically, tradition. The other thing that you're going to see will be Enlightenment thinkers. I know you guys have met the Enlightenment before. We've also met Hobbes and Locke before. They tell us about the basis of the state, with lovely Locke adding in the addition of states' responsibilities to protect natural rights, not just to provide security. We also met Jean-Jacques Rousseau yesterday, who gives us the idea of the general will, that the government should represent, its action should represent what the majority want. And last of all, we also met Baron de Montesquieu, at least through his ideas, that we need separation of powers to have a limited government. He also introduced the idea that to have an effective democracy, citizens need to have civic virtue. And that really is where we'll stop. Okay, and if you missed anything or my botched slides there kind of messed things up again, there will be a recording I'll make a recording in another class that doesn't have that choppy double notes mismatched things, so you guys can get that later. And on your way out, I will hand you the reading you need for your